Welcome to This Moment We're In, the show that explores how teams are navigating AI-driven change in real time, from messy experiments and breakthrough solutions to thought-provoking ideas about how roles, collaboration, and talent are being reimagined. I'm Cindy Chastain, and today I'm talking with Thu Do, a product builder, strategist, designer, founder, and systems thinker whose career has never fit neatly into a single category. And honestly, that may be exactly why her perspective feels so relevant right now. Because for years, organizations have been structured around specialization. You've got design over here, engineering over here, product somewhere in the middle. But as AI begins to collapse the cost of execution, many of those boundaries are starting to break down. And the people who seem best equipped for this moment are often the ones who learned how to move across disciplines long before companies knew how to value that skill. Thu has written and spoken extensively about coherence, tacit knowledge, organizational drift, and the hidden cost of fragmented thinking inside of product development teams. And what I find so compelling about her work is that she's not approaching these ideas theoretically. She's living inside the transition itself, working with startups, building products, shaping AI workflows, and watching in real time as the assumptions underneath modern products start to shift. Thu, it's so great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
In our conversations, you've described yourself as someone who never really fit neatly into a single lane.
Yeah.
I can relate to that myself. But you had business, you even have an MBA, design, technology roles. When you look back at that, do you think that felt accidental, or do you think you were already intuitively moving toward a different way of thinking about work?
Yeah. Wow. I love that question. I think it gets to the core of who I am and where I come from, to be honest with you. So I'm originally from Vietnam, and I left Vietnam when I was 15 or so. And my first stop, Cindy, was in Texas. Okay. I got down the plane. I saw these kind of like 6-lane highway and immediately knew that I was in a different world. I also stay with a very Western family. So, trail ride, horseback riding, rodeo, the whole thing. And so from Vietnam to Texas and now living and working in New York, there's a bit of a bit of a dance, a little bit of a juxtaposition between my culture, heritage, but also even in the US, this kind of Western cowboy mixed with Yankee, that kind of shape who I am as a person very early on in my adulthood. And then as I get into the work that I do, as you have pointed out, I've never felt like I fitted neatly into one thing. And, that has been a theme through my career, which has always, up until now, felt like a insurance. But now in this day of age, it felt like a strength.
You said that one of your earlier roles was also as a technologist or creative technologist.
Yeah, I was thankful that out of school I went to New York with 2 suitcases and got a job at one of these advertising agencies. Even though I studied design, I got this role as a creative technologist, which is in itself a blend between design and technology. And to be honest, in the agency, nobody really knew what I was supposed to do. Is that I was just supposed to tinker with things and pitching for things. But interestingly, in the same agency, within the span of 4 years, I moved from a designer role to a creative technologist role to a management consultant role, working directly with client as almost like an account director. And in that period of time, I felt like I had 3 different roles merged into one.
And how did that serve you? Was it something that was easy to navigate in that context, or did you bump up against boundaries, questions in an otherwise structured organization?
Yeah, that's such an intriguing question. I've always felt a bit like a nowhere person, meaning like I don't
Mm.
really belong in one bucket. And therefore, this notion of, am I allowed to think about something? Am I allowed to be creative? Am I allowed to deal with technology when, let's say, my title is creative technologist? So I felt like I'm having to constantly ask for permission to think, as
Hmm.
well as feeling a little bit like a threat. When I got my green card as an immigrant, I decided that, I want to find an environment where I can be more in control of how I use my skill and use it in a way that is more diverse and versatile, I guess is the word.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like you also felt innately that you did not need to choose one thing or another.
Yeah, and I couldn't even if I tried. In everything that I do, I've always had a tinker on the side.
Yeah.
I've always had a startup in my pocket that I'm working on of some sort, and come to peace now that is part of who I am, and I think that's what makes me maybe uniquely positioned to work with innovation team and startups and enterprises who are trying to innovate in AI, because it allows me to take this toolbox with all these different skills, but
Hmm.
also this mentality of I'm gonna use any skills that I need in order to learn more about the problems and solve them.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I used to always talk to my teams about this notion of a T-shaped person.
Yeah, yeah,
Have you heard of that concept?
yeah.
And for those listeners who might not have heard of this before, the idea is that you start your career with a focus area, which becomes your deep expertise. And as
Mm,
you, you know, grow in your career, you start to gain literacy in a number of different places. You might have started
mm.
out as a designer, but then you gain greater literacy and skills in technology or research or content. But in our conversations, you mentioned this idea of an X-shaped person, which I thought was
Yeah.
so intriguing because that's exactly what you are.
Yeah, I've heard W shape. I've heard from you like dual T shapes.
Tools.
If you're like a
Yeah,
Star
yeah.
Wars fans, you're now, two sabers, lightsabers. Anyway, a little nerdy, two sabers, two
Yeah,
hands.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, X shape. So yeah, this is something that I've coined, that I have been trying to put out there to help people like me and to help organizations to understand people like me, to
Yeah,
be honest.
yeah.
And an X-shaped person is someone who really connect the dots between disciplines, to be honest. Is
Hmm.
not someone who do all the things and burn out. Is more of a person who can connect between, for me, design, technology, product, and go to
Hmm.
market. So
Yep.
imagine if in an innovation team or a startup, this is someone who can ask the question of, hey, is this product the thing that we want to build, or do we just need to market what we have better? And I think that ability to not only stay aware and understand what is, but also connecting these dots to help businesses move forward to what could be is a special skill, and I think it's often misunderstood. Like I said, not fitting in a box, but in this era where information is in abundance, more so than ever before, and then these functions are becoming disjointed. Is this type of people or person who can really gel and connect
Hmm.
context together.
Yeah. I want to get to that point around why that's so important now, because it does feel like it's where things are headed.
Mm.
However, what I find very interesting that also came up in our conversation is you talked about this idea of the org chart being a map of who is allowed to think about what. And I think
Mm.
that's where modern product development arrived at.
Well, think about what Toyota and that assembly lines was trying
Yeah.
to do, right? Like you have units and people need to be very good at producing that unit. And then you have this long assembly line that connect to each other. I felt like product teams and even business in larger context have been used to that idea of production line or assembly line, and less so of one person needs to be able to hop around in different parts in order to understand the whole, in order to innovate on, for this car, using this material in this component is better for the whole car, right? So I know that is a very kind of physical example, but I truly believe that we're moving from the Toyota way or the Toyota model to something that is a lot more fluid and more fun and exciting for business and people to participate in.
And also challenging.
And
when you think of how organizations are built, how performance is reviewed, how processes are built. But you're right, it's really changing. And as someone who's spent a long time operating across disciplines, it's almost as if you have the ability to pull up different lenses to see things from a vantage point that allows you to make those connections. It feels like you're starting to develop a language for some of the things that organizations are starting to feel, because we're seeing all kinds of evidence of how roles are blurring. And one of those ideas that you named in an article you wrote called Coherence as a Prerequisite for Good Thinking, which I thought was just wonderful. What struck me about that piece is that you're not talking about coherence, like being able to see those things as alignment theater or consensus, but you're talking about something much deeper, a shared understanding, a shared context, a shared comprehension of a product and what it's supposed to enable. So when you use the word coherence in the context of product development, what do you actually mean by that? And can you share an example of what it looks like when a team truly has it?
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for bringing up that article. I've always found it to be almost like a responsibility to capture reflections and learning along the way, even if they are not totally right, or even if they might change the next day, because I think it's important to as professional working in this new ways of working era, that we evolve it together.
Especially now.
Especially now, and especially now that hands-on doing, I believe, is the way to learn and the way to evolve, and for business and person alike. And so I simply define coherence as having an understanding of what is in order to move towards what's next. So I'll give you an example. So in my work right now, I work a lot with innovation teams, advising them, as well as startups, building something from nothing, right? Often in the product development context. So stay with me on that front. If the listener is not in product development, I think it's pretty applicable towards many different fields. But in product development, you would often have, let's say, one of the team that I'm working with right now have 6 people. 1 product and design, that's me, again, merging a role, even though I do a lot more than that. And then 5 engineers, but really they are product engineers. So again, a lot of merging there. With this team of 6 people, coherence and having an understanding of what is it that we have? What is it that we have built? What is it that we have learned from all of our sales conversation, all of our customer insight, all of our, kind of like investor feedback? All of that context can be captured in either text or video form. And with this existence of a coherence knowledge base and a process to feed all of that into one place, we have an understanding of what is in order to make decision on what we need to, let's say, build next. And that enable us to move extremely fast and to shape the product, not only by velocity, but also for the better. Like we're that much closer to customers and investor and market insights because we have this same shared of coherence.
Yeah. I love that. And what you describe is something that feels incredibly useful and beneficial to a team in terms of what outcomes they're trying to drive before we ended up in this period of massive AI acceleration. But it sounds like coherence has become especially important because of the speed.
Absolutely. And I would go further than to say that it's not only especially important, it's crippling not to have coherence. It's actually the base of making good, sound decision for our businesses that can compete and that does not waste resourcing, that make our people happy and productive. And so there's so many implications to why coherence is now the prerequisite to having a sound, successful business. And often you mentioned this note around, it used to be that, it's not a new problem to get alignment, right? Which I see it as different than having coherence. Alignment often comes in the form of a yearly offsite or, some sort of big strategy meeting that we do or OKR planning that we do every quarter. Coherence is a continuous process that depends on having the system that is there to capture that knowledge and then a continuous process to feed into that system.
So let's talk about that then. You described to me some really vivid moments where organizations realized that they weren't operating with the same understanding of the product, the customer, or even the work itself. So let's talk about some of those moments that you've experienced in the thick of it where coherence breaks. I think one of them that you mentioned was it was about this idea of a team that couldn't agree on what a product does.
Yeah, I've sat in some long meetings. We all do, but they're increasingly become longer as we speak. When you come to the table and you ask a simple question of, well, how is our onboarding working right now? And 3 people on the team would have a slight different answer because they own slightly different things. So the marketing person will focus on top funnel, right? And these are the things that I do in customer success and onboarding them. And then the product person would talk about what they've built. And of course, even within the product function, there are different answers on that. And I think when 3 people, let's say, explain the product in 3 different ways, what's happening is not only the missing of alignment, as that's not a new problem again, but that because AI is accelerating execution to a point where the product marketing person over here have generated 10 different pieces of content and promised maybe 3 new features by the time lunch hits. And then the product person over here has already prototyped, built, and launched 3 new features by the time that dinner arrives. If we are not building the system and the ways for those people to talk together, we end up building 3 different things that maybe are just, 5% deviant from each other. But over time, they really compound. And so you have this problem then of coming to the table and asking, what is our product? What is our service? And the answer is slightly different depending on who you ask.
Yeah. The thing that's fascinating to me is the idea of this compounding over time. They might be small, but over the course of many months when things are moving that quickly, then I'm sure that gap becomes even wider. Right?
Yeah. So 2 hours in, we're still talking about the same thing. And me as an X shaped person in the room, I'm like, you talked about this. Let's pull that thread. Let's tie that over here. Let's actually put system in place and process in place so that we can update and refine our understanding over time. There's a few new functions that came out of that. Context engineering, product operation, you know, that's deal with that idea of how do we enable this building of system and process to capture context.
I'd like to also talk about another example, and it was about the AI model you couldn't train without the domain expert. We're seeing this a lot, especially in agentic workflows, where if it's internal facing, you really need the people, the domain experts, to be there as part of the build, not just the designers or the product people. But what did you learn?
I'm working with another startup. As a product and technology person, I still go to that expert every day and asking them around their operation procedures, about how they service the customer, about things that they learn, about, the way that we need to be interacting with customer in real life. There's a lot of movements this day to capture the knowledge of that domain expert in some AI avatar, like in some rack knowledge base. But I still believe in having that person in the room and being in proximity and look at them in the eyes and, all of the really instinctual human signals that I wouldn't get from just reading text from AI alone.
Yeah. Well, I have a question for you. Based on that experience, what do you feel about this notion that sometimes those domain experts might need to become product owners themselves?
And they are. Everyone is a product owner these days.
Yeah.
I was a designer. I'm now a product owner. My engineers are now product owners, and I allowed them to do design. I think these days, again, this idea of a business needs to be able to loosen control so that everybody can have ownership around decision, but also democratize skills that used to live in one function, let's just say design, for others to do it too. And so I do think that, that operational, let's say, domain expert person is now a product owner. They might work on slightly different products or service, but they are a product owner nevertheless.
Yeah. Well, I also want to talk about this idea of total democratization. And I'm seeing a spectrum of beliefs around that. 2 or 3 years ago, people were very, very fiercely guarded around their territories, right? And now people are like, oh, that's great. A product manager can create something.
Yeah.
But how does expertise, when everyone is not an X-shaped person, how do you maintain that level of quality within so much democratization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm still learning that balance right now. So, for example, in one of the teams that I'm leading, we would have, let's say, 4 different projects going on at the same time. All of them have product components, which each of these leads, whether they come from design like me or from engineer or from marketing, they all own product. But in shaping up that brief, that project around what should the product do in that project, they have to do some design. They have to do some kind of like market testing, talking with customers. All those skills used to live with the designer, and you're right, like we used to be very protective of that. But these days, I kind of just go ahead and say, you all must design, prototype with Claude design, with Claude code, in order to shape up what we should build, right? With a prototype, you can go and talk to a customer and get feedback before you get into like expensive build mode. But that anything that is hairy, that is complex, that is like touching multiple pieces should be led by the expert in the room. So in this case, as a lead designer who has the most experience in design, my sprint or my focus for a project would be looking over a big, hairy problem that span across the product, and then enable and empower others to use design in a way that is useful to them.
Got
So
it.
with democratization, I think while all of those pieces are happening, there still needs to be ownership in domain expertise on the big, hairy problems that a function needs to be able to do. I wouldn't be able to go to an engineer and say, well, yeah, I'm just going to go and debug this and, approve the PR. I wouldn't want to, right? It is not my expertise, but hell, if somebody touching this hairy problem without me, I have a problem with that,
Yeah. So it sounds like it's also about just making really practical decisions around who should be leaning in on what. And could I also say, based on what you've been sharing here, that when you have a strong degree of coherence, that it actually makes those moves, those shifts much easier because there's the shared, I think you called it the shared brain, which we'll get to as well.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about that. I think that seems like a natural connection to talking about, in order to enable coherence, we need the systems, and then we need the people willing and able and the process to feed that system. And in the example that I just shared, right, we have 4 projects led by different people. They're now using AI tools and this kind of coherent knowledge base in order to shape and build and make decisions and innovate for the business, right? And without the same starting point, for lack of better words, right? Without the same knowledge base, each one of us would be innovating and getting slightly different outputs. There are, in my mind, 4 different systems that allowed for and enable a great coherent knowledge base. They are the design system. This is something that is existing. Businesses and startups all have it. They have the code base, so engineering's on GitHub or collaborating. This is also existing. So these 2 between design system and code base are familiar. Then we get into the other 2, which are a little bit less familiar. The third one is the experience map. What this is that if you recall in one of your strategy meetings and the strategists start mapping out how the customer will move through the experience, the service design side of things, where they can capture how, let's say, a person moved through a store and interacting with all the POS, for example. Usually that exercise gets done once and then, kind of in that strategy session and then get faded into the abyss. The proposal here is that experience map, the one who's capturing the relational knowledge between different touch points and between different systems, need to be continuously updated. This in itself really, it does exist at one moment in time, but it doesn't exist continuously through the life of the innovation.
It sounds like you're talking about a holistic view of a product experience, or it could be an ecosystem of products, whatever the case may be. But the experience map is that record of truth around where it happens to be in any one moment in time, to see how all the parts and pieces actually fit together or are related to the customer's experience.
Yeah.
Within that. Is that fair?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious on your end too, because you've led, experience design, and you've led teams where I can imagine that the complexity grows over time tremendously. How have you kind of in the past been able to capture that that scope of experience?
One of the ways that was most effective was having I would call it really a service design map, not necessarily the future state, but the current state that should be in some way, shape, or form, a living representation of where things are at any given moment, and use that as a kind of guide for strategically identifying where are the places to fix, where are the places to optimize, where can you innovate.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
it's a never-ending project, but that
Yeah.
becomes, as I used to say, a strategic tool,
Yeah.
but not
Yeah.
something that you do once.
It's
And if
not
you
something that
have
you
that,
want.
yeah, and if everyone on the team has that shared view, suddenly they're able to make decisions that are cognizant of the whole rather than the piece that they own.
That's exactly right. And I would go as far as saying, it needs to grow over time. Everybody needs to have a view of it. I would go as far as to say it used to live with one person or a very small selective group of people who can maintain it. This third system, the experience map, tend to work best when updated by everyone, which led me to this fourth one, which is a shared brain. I think you mentioned it very briefly. The shared brain is a context based system, whereas all of our knowledge, whether that comes from the product briefs that we created, but also our customer feedback, the sales calls, some of the things that I touched on at the beginning of the podcast, all get fed into a text-based knowledge hub that then live on something like a code repository, or for an enterprise, it will live in your enterprise cloud system, for example, and get updated over time. How this differ from the experience map is that experience map is by name very experience driven, very customer driven, whereas this shared brain is a lot more complex and a lot truly like a shared brain of the organization. And that too, Cindy, I feel like needs a new ways of working so that everyone, not only the product person, but the marketers, the leadership team, the, salespeople, all need to be able to contribute towards this share brain. An example of this, do we have time for an example?
Oh, yes, please. Always.
Always. So my partner works for a health tech startup, and he has written also about creating this core text, where everyone of his engineering team at the end of a commitment cycle, of a build cycle, would be able to contribute just one note, just one text note into this shared cortex. And over time, I think he pitted two AI agents against each other, one with access to this cortex and the other without. And the one without passes test. It's still good, right? But it passes test maybe like 80%. The one with context and this knowledge base passed to the level of like 98% of something crazy like that. Like
Wow.
crazily huge improvement. So for a business, not even in product development, just imagine, having that system and that process in place so that in every decision that we make, we have the coherence of the system to understand what is in order to make good decision from that point onwards.
Yeah. So let's talk about what is for a minute, because there's so much you could capture. You mentioned things like tacit knowledge. You've already mentioned decisions. That's pretty clear. We can put that into the shared brain. But what other kinds of things do you think should
You're
go
ready
into
for
the
new
shared
words?
brain?
I'm just making up new words because I don't have We don't have current words for them.
Okay.
So, but I love that question. Clearly, that you've read my article. Thank you. uh, but
I
yeah,
loved it, but yeah.
I think, when we think about context, especially in generative AI, we often think about text-based
Hmm.
knowledge, right? Things that can be written down. To your point, a decision, a note, a meeting note, transcript, etc.
Yeah.
Um, but there are, in my mind, three different type. That written type is called explicit, is something that you explicitly either said or written down and things like that. The
Hmm.
other one are latent and tacit. So latent is the transitional kind of unspoken knowledge, is the kind of like, asking somebody in the room a question and them could just kind of like pausing a little bit too long before answering the question. So they might say yes, but that, you know, do you like this? Do you like this design? Mm, yes, like that yes when captured in text is still a yes. It's still, a
Yes, yes,
decision,
yes.
but you don't have the latent context. And then the tacit, like I said, it again sounds a little weird, but
So,
being in the room with other people, you know, rubbing shoulder with them is you get a lot of context from there. AI and startups are getting better at capturing them.
hmm.
Explicit context for sure, and the part of latent context, starting to do facial tracking and all this jazz. But tacit context, the relationals of you, me being in the same room and having unspoken experiences are much harder to capture. But they are part of the knowledge base and they're part of what makes the picture complete, you know?
Hmm. That makes sense. Part of the kind of shared understanding, or honestly, the tacit sort of, to use the word,
Yeah.
agreements that happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love the idea that you've clearly laid out these four systems. So you've got the code base, a design
Mhm.
system, an experience map, and then this idea of a shared brain, which is so rich, could have many different types of knowledge. But let's help our listeners understand, why is it so important to have that shared brain and all of these things speaking to each other?
Mm. Yeah, I think in an information-rich environment that we're in, more so than ever before, it's very hard for us humans to catch up, and that's why we have that problem of teammates when asked a question have three different answers. Fundamentally, with richer context, as a team, as a business, we'll get much better outputs, quality-wise, but also competitive-wise, when we know, hey, the next
Mm.
service or the next product that we build is based on this white space in the market, but also on that customer insight, 3 months ago, or on that, uh, experiment that this one person have run on the go-to-market. All of those insights help us to make better decisions.
Hmm. Yeah, I could see that. And you could also say that in some way, it also de-risks the
Yeah.
decisions and the output, because it has the system, the coherence, the brain all working together.
Yeah, and speaking of de-risk, honestly, AI is accelerating executions. The challenge is in not spending on execution. We have to spend on shaping. And let me
Mm.
drill in on that. Shaping is a process in which we figure out what is it that we need to create. And in a world where we can create anything instantly, teams are now reversing the time that they used to spend on shaping versus execution and spin that around, the other way around. What I mean by that is that, in a product team, for example, you used to have a product manager spending maybe 20% crafting the product brief, right? That's the shaping act. and then 80% for the designer and the
Mm-hmm.
engineers to execute. These days, every one of those people, product manager, designer, engineers, are spending 80% on shaping the thing and then using AI tool the rest of the 20% to execute. We can talk about what happened when AI generate 90,000 lines of code, which is another, 20% of extra work of reviewing that stuff.
Right. The
But
new bottleneck, right?
yeah, the new bottleneck.
Yeah.
But yeah, I find that fascinating, like the invert between, crafting the ideas and what we need to build and the problem we need to solve versus executing on the idea.
I love that. But what would you say to teams who are not getting the opportunity because they're still so pressured to move quickly that maybe they're not taking the 80% to shape because they've saved so much time on the execution point that everything's just trying to accelerate? Because it would make sense, especially if you need to put all that effort into building a context that gives you more clarity, better outcomes, etc.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if everyone's experiencing that. I love the idea that it could flip.
Yeah. I think it's efficiency is masquerading as good.
Mm-hmm.
And we will find out when it's not good. I was working with a startup and I was using my personal account and to do some Claude code and Claude design to prototype this idea. And because it's my personal account, token costs, it behooved me to execute quickly. So I could go in there and I could prompt myself away and I could get an output very quickly. But then I find myself having to come back and iterate until it's right. And that is very costly. And that's a longer loop than people realize. And maybe they're experiencing that right now. Instead, now what I've learned is that I've reverted that workflow and I actually spend the majority of my time working within Claude Chat, which is much cheaper, on the prompts themselves in order to get as close to that final output that I want before I get the AI to execute. So I know that is a micro example of, at a larger scale.
It's such a great example because I feel like that's a huge reason why teams should start to think about taking more time to shape.
Yeah.
Because it's a cost savings thing.
It is
and
a cost
it not only gives you, that's very compelling for any CFO out there. Rather than, another example that I've heard is, hey, we have these tools now. We don't need to do this research. Let's just create 6 different variations and test them. That's really expensive when you think of, the cost in doing so.
To be honest, the actual costs of these tokens and these iterations are much higher than what we're seeing now. And yet, right, I think there's still this trend of leadership with access to prototype, do something and say, do this, right? Without the context, but without the full picture of what needs to be done. I still think that leadership and the team need to sit together and actually talk about what needs to be done before we go and execute.
I agree. And I think that also has implications potentially around roles, the teams themselves, because to do the shaping work requires a mixture of X-shaped people, domain experts, to be able to do the shaping, which not only gets you better outcomes, it saves token costs because you have a better aim. One of my early podcasts said, it's about finding the right aim by doing the work up front. So I find that, incredibly compelling. And I think you'd even said in your article something about that while the cost of execution has decreased, the cost of coherence has not.
Yeah. Because the cost of finding, this type of teammates and people who are interested and willing to look beyond their roles and organization who make space for that the cost of getting to that space or that ways of working, rather, it will take time and it will take iteration. But it's the way, I believe that's the way that the world is moving.
I think what you're also pointing to is a real collapse of functional product development as we've known it for some time, not just a speeding up or a compression, as if it were an accordion, and you speed up certain parts and not others. And we've seen that. But what I really find interesting in these examples, too, is that this is something you're pointing to that's much larger than communication or information, because if the bottleneck is no longer execution, the bottleneck becomes comprehension, judgment, relational knowledge,
Yes.
context building. And that's what's challenging some of the foundational assumptions around
Yes.
the product development lifecycle and the way they've been designed over the last, 10, 15 years. So this is where that critique of the org chart that you mentioned before becomes so fascinating. You mentioned that the org chart stopped being a map of responsibility and became a map of who's allowed to think about what. At the same time, there will not be a whole organization full of X-shaped people. You're going to have a mix. It seems possible that some of those people who are really good about being connectors, and sometimes I like to say the glue, who can see all that, might be the way, or the leaders who's helped shape and bring coherence to teams.
Yeah.
Because they can see that.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. I really appreciate that call out. By no means that actually people should be the only people that exist, because if you have all the glue, then suddenly there's nothing to glue on, right? So I love people who are domain experts. We talked about this, and I truly think there's a space for people who really specialize, because the other side of that equation is that when you can do everything, you shouldn't be doing everything. So a designer who turns a product owner should still be strong in her design craft.
What I find compelling about your perspective is you're not just describing a future problem, you're describing a structural transition that's already underway inside of teams right now. And many organizations still seem to be operating with the industrial era assumptions about specialization, efficiency, how they're hiring, even management itself, despite the fact that the nature of work is clearly just changing underneath, in plain sight.
Yeah.
So if coherence is becoming a competitive advantage as you describe it, and if roles and workflows and decision-making and structures are starting to reorganize around it, what do leaders fundamentally need to understand right now that many of them might be missing?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the threats that we've just talked about, but it's worth maybe pulling them all together. When we are thinking about the value of human work in an AI world, it's very much about understanding the comprehension of what is, and a judgment, taste, ability to decide on what needs to be next. It has this implication of course, having the system, processes, and people in place to build that coherence up front and continuously updating it throughout the company life cycle. But it's also with regarding to people and structure, this question around who's allowed to own what's ownership looks like, and what accountability looks like, what workloads look like according to, the accountability and ownership that's stated. That's one questions around the democratization of ownership. The second one has to do with making sure that in addition to the domain expertise in the room, we have those glue people, the X-shaped people who's allowed to connect the dots. And then I would say, you know, talking about the value of human work, I'm a big proponent of advancing what it is that make us truly human. And I believe that, our creativity and our ability to pass on knowledge or to guide or, our ability to really interact with each other, all of those things that are not yet capturable by machines are what makes us not only special as a species, but also competitive advantage for the kind of companies, the kind of team that nurture those kind of uniqueness. So what I meant by that is that for creativity is about creating room for people to experiment, learn towards outcome, for having more senior members guiding the younger teams or like the transitional team and allowing them to build up knowledge over time. And then the last thing around tacit, the ability to be in the room with people or even on Zoom with people, but having relationships and building communities of belonging, that comes from the care that a company can give to its employees, to its, co-creators. I think for a team to be sustainable and to grow over time, I think that relationship and that tacit knowledge needs to be nurtured and kind of protected.
One of the things that's really stayed with me throughout this conversation is that beneath all the discussions around AI systems, workflows, organizational structure, this is clearly a conversation about people. And the ability to synthesize across disciplines. We talked about democratization. There's blurring of roles, but I think there's a difference between blurring that's anxiety-inducing versus blurring that's intentional and productive, right?
Yes, and sustainable. Yeah,
and sustainable. True. And in so many ways, your career really has reflected that tension before this moment. You spent so much of your life operating within and across categories rather than neatly inside them. So as we close, I want to come back to something you said before, that your life work is really about using technology to advance what makes us uniquely human. And you mentioned that earlier, but can you say anything else about what this means to you now?
Thank you for that question. I think a lot of the pieces that I'm keenly interested in these days has to do with new ways of working. That's why I try to write so much about it. And thank you for that space to discuss this topic in your podcast. I do so not only because, I do so not because I believe that everything that I say is true, but because I think there needs to be somebody saying it out loud and talking about capacity and sustainability and talking about the entry-level folks and talking about all the things that are happening and that are having a real impact on people and businesses, but are not always prioritized or spoken out loud, or simply because there's so much noise that, adding a voice into the mix of folks who kind of look and sound like me is in itself an act of contribution. So that's what humanity and investing in what makes us human means to me these days, is to do the work that I do, help as much as I can, do a lot of reflection and thinking out there for people to feedback on and to iterate upon and to implement in their team, so that humans and knowledge workers specifically have a space and a role that is uniquely for them in this AI era world.
Thank you. This conversation with you two has genuinely given me great hope. And we certainly need voices. Yes, win. But we certainly need voices with such generosity and interest in moving the conversation. To your point, thinking out loud is really what that's about, and learning. And with that orientation, I think that could make this a kind of exciting and interesting moment, quite frankly. And hopefully other people will feel that as well.
Yes. Now is your moment.
Yes. There is a place. But I also share your deep interest in ways of working, because it is so much about people and their interactions. And so thank you for sharing your thoughts. I've learned so much. And I wish we could just continue. I really, really appreciate your openness and willingness to share just who you are, which I think is also such a really important part of it. So thank you for coming onto the show. I can't wait to see how your thinking evolves from here.
Thank you. I can't wait to hear back from everyone who's listening. And
yes, we'll put everything about we'll put everything about you in the show notes. So please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thanks too. One of the ideas I keep thinking about from this conversation is that as execution becomes easier and as more people gain the ability to build, the questions, what should we build and why, become even more important. And so does making sure we're solving the right problem in the first place. Answering those questions requires a shared understanding grounded in what is actually true about a product or service, what customers are experiencing, and what the organization has learned, not a fragmented, filtered view through a single role or discipline. And that's what two means by coherence. It is very different from alignment in the traditional corporate sense. It's not consensus. It requires a set of systems, including what two calls a shared brain, that continuously captures the knowledge needed to make better decisions. And perhaps most compelling, two is suggesting that this kind of coherence doesn't just lead to better outcomes. It can reduce costs, especially when time saved in execution is reinvested in shaping and de-risking. That's why this conversation feels bigger than product development, because beneath the discussion about AI is a very human question. What kinds of people, teams, and ways of working help us make sense of complexity together? And if two is right, the teams that learn to build coherence may ultimately move faster, not because they execute more quickly, but because they understand more clearly where they're trying to go, and better decisions become easier to make. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please share and subscribe, and hope I see you next time.